Festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh. To actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, JLF Colorado, Teamwork Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you back to JLF Colorado 2020 Virtual Festival. Our next session is Oceans and the New Thalassology, David Abulafia in conversation with William Dalrymple. Oceans and seas across the world have played a pivotal role in the development of world history. They stand not just as a testament to political and economic change, but also play an integral role in the spread of ideas and religion across the planet. They have recently found themselves under scrutiny as major drivers of change in human affairs and as a subject of a major wave of exciting and path-breaking historical scholarship. One of the leading figures of this new wave is Emeritus Cambridge Don David Abulafia. He's the Wolfson Prize-winning author of books such as The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans, and The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, among others. In conversation with historian and festival co-director William Dalrymple, Abulaffia offers a fresh perspective on the extraordinary narrative of humanity and its relationship with the sea. Our podcast partner for this session is Lonchora. David Abulafia is Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History at Cambridge University, where he has spent his career. His books have won him the British Academy Medal, the Mountbatten Literary Award, and most recently, the Wolfson History Prize. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and Visiting Professor at the College of Europe in Warsaw and the newly founded University of Gibraltar. William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of City of Jinns, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, 9 Lives, Return of a King, and Kohinoor. He has won many awards and has been shortlisted 4 times for the Samuel Johnson Baillie Gifford Prize and been awarded the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy. His new books are The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, and Forgotten Masters, Indian Painting for the East India Company. Dalrymple is one of the founders and co-directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please do follow our handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on our upcoming sessions. As you all know, in these unusually difficult times, we struggle to bring to you JLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. We request you all to please donate generously to the festival that will allow the continuous flow of knowledge and information freely and seamlessly. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Oceans and the New Thalassology, David Abulafia in conversation with William Dalrymple. Over to you, William.
Thank you, Kritika, and hello, David.
Hello.
A great pleasure to finally get you to Jaipur. I used to attend your lectures 150 years ago when I was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
But I think this is the first time we've ever been on a platform together, so I'm very excited to. So back then, studying history at Cambridge, oceans appeared very little in the syllabus. There was Brodell's Mediterranean, which everyone had to read, but in general, things were very much based on land. Why do you think that's changed so much lately? And this is obviously a movement you've been on the forefront of.
I think part of it is to do with a sense that national histories have not quite sort of satisfied the need to understand the wider context of what's going on in the world, that there's been so much emphasis on these national histories. The focus has moved away from really understanding the relationship between different parts of the world. For instance, if you look at the history of England, the amount of interest that's been developed in England's foreign relations in the medieval or the Tudor period is really quite minimal compared to the amount of attention that's given to internal affairs. But actually, in order to understand a lot of what's going on, I mean, talking about England, one's talking about a country whose prosperity in the Middle Ages depended very much on the wool trade across the North Sea, across the English Channel, towards Flanders, and on the arrival of vast quantities of silver which were coming in to pay for that, which is one of the issues I mention in my book, The Boundless Sea. So those maritime connections have really had a crucial role. In my own case, there were really two routes to my interest in maritime history. One was this famous French historian Fernand Braudel, about whom I had never heard until my final year as an undergraduate. And I went to be taught by somebody who had a great interest in the history of European expansion, a historian called Geoffrey Scammell. And he said to me one week, you need to write an essay about the Mediterranean. And there's this book by Braudel, which at that stage was, I think, still being translated into English, or perhaps it was very difficult to get hold of in the English translation. So I had to read this enormous work, who am I to talk about enormous works, of over 1,000 pages, but in French. And it completely opened up a way of approaching the past with which I have to say I'd been unfamiliar up to that point. The Annales school, as it's called.
For those who don't know Braudel, just maybe talk about his research methods, filming archives in Algeria with cine cameras.
I mean, he was a difficult man, and by the end of his life, he was convinced that he was the greatest living historian, which is not something that a historian should think about himself or herself. However, what he did, he began to try to think about the Mediterranean from the perspective of its physical characteristics. And he also began to think in terms of connections across space. So he's very interested, having been for a time a student, junior lecturer, and so on in Algiers, he decided that he really needed to think very hard about some of those relationships across the Mediterranean. And this led him to this bird's eye perspective of the Mediterranean in the late 16th century, at the time of the major conflict between the Ottoman Turks and the Spaniards under the rule of King Philip II, one of the most energetic, one of the greatest of Spain's kings. So he started off with the traditional political history, but then he began to become more and more absorbed into the geography, the economic relationships, and so on. And so he was opening up a view of the Mediterranean which was quite different to anything that had been opened up before. He did spend part of his career writing this enormous work in Sao Paulo in Brazil, where it was difficult to get a job in the interwar period, so he was sent off there, and he took all these microfilms with him, the horrible, horrible little sort of microfilms all wrapped up in plastic or whatever, and he had a whole room in his hotel where he kept his microfilms, a separate room where he had the microfilms in his microfilm reader, and you would have thought he'd been driven blind by this, but he spent his days reading document after document from archives all around the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Dubrovnik in Croatia, which is one of the richest sources, and so on, and produced this extraordinary work. My criticism of the work, and of his followers as well, has always been that the human element tends to be left out, that although there are merchants moving back and forward and armies, navies moving back and forward, the idea that human beings themselves, individuals, can really mold the history of a space like the Mediterranean or one of the great oceans is something which is really absent from his way of thinking. And so when this great battle is fought between the Spaniards and the Turks in 1570, the Battle of Lepanto off the coast of Greece, to him, the outcome is inevitable. He talks of mysterious forces which have crossed the centuries, which have somehow produced this Spanish victory. And it wasn't like that. I actually look at it and you can see how decisions made by the commanders, the Spanish commanders, the Venetians who were involved, and mistakes made by the other side, these were all crucial in determining the outcome. So it's issues like that, this depersonalization, if you like, of history, which began to concern me after perhaps starting off as something of a Brodelian. I began to move away from that way of thinking. And it also led him to a dislike, a rejection almost, of political history. But again, you can't really understand a lot of these economic relationships without thinking about the political dimensions. So in my most recent book, The Boundless Sea, when I'm talking about, for instance, the relationship between China and Japan, the trading relationship was very, very important in the history of medieval Japan, but it was largely determined by the willingness of emperors or shoguns to allow foreign traders in, to allow contact to take place. And so you have to think about the individual, the choices made at particular moments.
I think we last actually ran into each other under the great painting of Lepanto in the Doge's Palace in Venice.
We did indeed, some years ago, yes. And there you were with I think one of your children and another child who was descended from the Doges, a member of the Damosto family.
One of the admirals of Lepanto.
Yeah, indeed, and they're above our heads. So yes, so as where we meet again at Lepanto. Yeah.
Now, David, what your work has been distinguished not only by putting the human element back into what had become a very socio-economically dominated historical discourse, but you've also been distinguished throughout your career in writing very much for a general audience. You haven't written exclusively for your peers. You have written specialist articles, of course, in scholarly magazines and so on, but you've also, throughout your career, from the time you wrote Frederick II onwards, written for a general audience. Have you found that made you suspicious in the eyes of some of your colleagues? Were you regarded as a crude populist who'd left the ivory tower to seek fame and fortune in trade publishing? I ask that only because there's been this recent article by Sanjay Subramaniam having a tilt at globalists who write fake history. But what's your response to all that?
You're absolutely right. One is the target of all sorts of suspicion and sort of in the academic world where there are lots of rivalries, picking up on the fact that someone has decided to write a book which is not the product of years and years and years of very deep research in an obscure archive and written for 3 other people in often jargon which is completely impenetrable. One has to be brave to say it, but I am brave in this respect and do say it. I think it is so important that we reach out to a wider audience. What are historians for? I mean, what I was just talking about, the way in which we need to break away sometimes from these national histories, which are important in themselves, but also think about relationships across space, across the Mediterranean, across the oceans. This is something which concerns all of us, and it's not just the subject for internal discussion among academics. And I think that what one tends to see in comments about some of the things I've written, I mean, for instance, my book on the Mediterranean, the Great Sea, came out in the wake of a revival of interest in the work of Brodel, about whom we've just been talking, but also some very specialized, very technical work which was done on the ecology of the Mediterranean in the Roman period and the early Middle Ages by a couple of historians called Horden and Purcell. They wrote this massive book called The Corrupting Sea. I have to say it's unreadable, but technically very, very accomplished. And the sort of sense that that is the way to do it. And the idea of writing a history of first the Mediterranean, now the oceans, from remote prehistory right up to the present day, is something that other historians perhaps don't have the courage to do. I mean, when I would say to people that I was writing a history of either the Mediterranean or the oceans, they would say to me, oh, so that's in what? The late Middle Ages, and then they would say, and which ocean in particular, and so on. The idea that one might do this globally is something that doesn't go down very well. But at the same time, writing global history, it has its challenges. There's a problem with languages, for instance. I can't read Chinese or Japanese, and so you do have to rely on translations of sources. You have to rely on the literature that's available in European languages. That is a challenge.
But it's been, I think, probably your most influential work, hasn't it? Has it been your best-selling book of all, The Boundless Sea?
Well, no, we don't know yet, and with COVID, I think there's been a bit of a problem, as it's been more difficult to sell books in the last few months. But the Great Sea, I mean, I don't have very many figures in for the Boundless Sea across the world, but the Great Sea sold extremely well, I have to say, and I was very, very gratified and nicely surprised. And the Boundless Sea, I think, yes, I mean, I'm hoping, particularly with the Chinese edition coming quite soon, the Chinese edition of the Great Sea did very well. So, yeah.
Fantastic. How do you even begin to go about writing a global history of? I mean, it's as difficult as writing a history of the world. I mean, the seas it's a vast undertaking. What was your process for beginning, and how did you plan to tie it all together? What were the ideas which held the whole thing into a manageable shape?
The main idea, which in a certain sense only surfaces from under the ocean halfway through the book, is that as far as possible one should try to write about the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, with a certain amount about the Arctic Ocean as well, but write about them together, try and look at the connections between them. If one's writing a history of the sea, one is writing a history of connections. So to divide it up into just Atlantic connections, and there's an enormous amount being written by very specialist historians on Atlantic history, more than any other maritime history, more than the Mediterranean, more than the Indian Ocean. So rather than dividing it up, I wanted to think about how those oceans interacted. But before that, before Christopher Columbus, before Vasco da Gama, one does have to treat them by and large separately. So the question then was, how do I order the oceans in the pre-Columbus period? And I decided to start with the Pacific, which comes as a bit of a surprise. People tend to think, well, the Pacific, this vast ocean space, which Europeans didn't begin to cross till the 16th century, with scattered islands. But of course, if you actually look at the history of the Pacific, you've got people crossing uncharted spaces millennia ago. We're talking about human beings going out to colonize the islands of Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, ultimately by the 14th century AD CE, reaching New Zealand. So that's quite late. Hawaii in the north again, quite late. Easter Island, which is in the middle of nowhere.
Our rivals in the early, I mean, going right back to the earliest periods, the other homonyms, I believe, didn't reach Australia. The Neanderthals, for example, never got there. They couldn't do both, while humans could.
Yeah, this was an area where, rather than Neanderthals, there's this newly discovered type of human, Denisovans, who sound as if they looked quite similar, but their DNA is distinct. And they got down to probably somewhere around what's now Malaysia, Indonesia. You have to remember that when the sea levels were lower, it was possible for them actually to reach quite a lot of these islands as they are now on land. But then there's this gap, the gap identified by Alfred Russel Wallace, the contemporary rival, if you like, of Darwin, the gap between Australasia and the rest of the world, basically, which explains why in Australia you have this extraordinary natural history with marsupials, which are extremely rare outside that area. So how people actually got across to Australia, well, we don't know, but they were our type of humans. And they ultimately, of course, they traveled by land from Africa. But I always say one of the things which people fail to take into account is that as humans spread out of, as our type of humans spread out of Africa, or earlier types of humans spread across the world, of course, they were encountering water. They had to learn to cross water. They had to learn to cross rivers and sometimes lakes. And this probably goes back to very early types of human being. So in the Indonesian islands, they've been discovering these miniature humans under Flores, the so-called hobbit, these very early humans who may have survived until only a few 10,000 years ago, who somehow managed to get across a watery space. It's astonishing how far not just humans but animals actually have managed to get in the face of the challenge of crossing the oceans.
And one of the things that struck me at the beginning of your book was that the extraordinary story of all those migrations from Indonesia and the China coast right down to Madagascar, vast distances in a very early period.
It is extraordinary. I mean, one of the dimensions of this Polynesian Pacific expansion that doesn't get written about, we think of all these Polynesians going in their canoes further and further eastwards. Nowadays, it's thought they probably did reach South America, but in very small numbers. And yet what we forget about is the very close links between the Indonesian, Malaysian area and Madagascar across the Indian Ocean. And during what we call the Middle Ages, whether you can use the term for these people is another question, but during the Middle Ages, there were these people, apparently from Borneo, who arrived year after year along the coasts of India, Africa, and finally, indeed, Madagascar. And they were the first colonists, the first human colonists of Madagascar. Later, they brought in some African sort of slave populations and so on. So the population there's a little bit mixed. But the language, the closest language to Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, is actually a dialect of Indonesian spoken in Borneo. It is extraordinary. And yes, I mean, it's testimony to the most extraordinary maritime skills, which in many ways actually surpassed those of Europeans.
Yeah. Again, this is an Indian festival, and as a historian of India, I was fascinated by the material you were writing about the early Indian exploration of the Indian Ocean, that expansion of Indian soft power, language, and particularly the two great religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, right across the Southeast Asian littoral. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And empires like Srivijaya, which I suspect many people listening won't know about.
It is one of the most fascinating aspects, it seems to me, of the history of the Indian Ocean, that we always tend to write it, first of all, in the light of the arrival of the Portuguese and the Dutch and so on, so from 1500 onwards. And then before that, we have this image of Arab dhows coming down the Red Sea, going down the coast of Africa, reaching India. And they certainly existed, those ships. But and also Chinese ships, which occasionally managed to get as far as India or even possibly Arabia. But what we forget about is the role of the Indians, Tamils and others, the role also of the Malays. All these people played an absolutely crucial role in maintaining contact between Indonesia, Malaysia, and lands further west. And this, of course, turned very much on the spice trade. The trade from Indonesia towards China was also extremely intense. The Chinese bought far more pepper than the Europeans or ancient Romans or whoever it was who did buy pepper from India. So these products were going in two directions, out of the East Indies and out of India, and the quantities were absolutely astonishing. But one has to understand that that just because the documents, I mean, if you go back 2,000 years, you've got an account of the trade of the Indian Ocean written by a Greek living in Egypt. He seems to have been a merchant who specialized in tortoise shells. He really... So, yeah, and so we have this image of what were called the Yavana in the Indian documents. They are described in Indian documents, who settled in various places along the coast of southern India and even got as far as Pondicherry on the other side. But of course, that's only a tiny part of the story. And one thing which I've tried to do in my book, The Boundless Sea, is constantly to remind people that the native networks are absolutely crucial. And this is also true once you get into the Portuguese and the Dutch periods. Once you get into the 16th and 17th centuries, the Portuguese discovered they couldn't dominate the trade. Vasco da Gama and his followers could not dominate the spice trade. They had competition from the Turks. They had competition also from other Europeans like the Dutch. And so the Portuguese and the Dutch ended up basically just sort of siphoning off profits from what we call the country trade, which was extremely active between, let's say, India and the Straits of Malacca, all that sort of thing.
And as well as trade, you talk a great deal about religions and civilizations and cultures crossing across the Indian Ocean. Do you want to talk a little?
Yes. That is one of the aspects that fascinates me most, because when one's talking about the objects traded, you only have to look at them. And what do you find? You find Buddhas, you find all sorts of religious articles which are traveling eastwards from India. Well, you mentioned Srivijaya, and Srivijaya, that is to say, a maritime sort of empire, perhaps is a strong word, but a maritime network which was based in Palembang in Sumatra, which had very close relations with India, but also close relations with Java, China, and so on. All these goods passing through that network of islands. And so there you would find academies of Buddhist learning, things like that, which were visited by people coming from all sorts of directions. And one of the really fascinating things that I found was some of the diaries of these monks who were moving, whether across the Indian Ocean or across the South China Sea.
And,
yeah, exactly. Yes. And this is taking us away from the waters around India, but there's an absolutely fascinating account by Enin, a Japanese monk who insists on going to China and is constantly being chased by the authorities who say, you shouldn't be here, you're an illegal immigrant. And then he gets the protection of a Korean warlord, a very violent Korean warlord, who is eventually put to death by his rivals. So there's most amazing material, but what it shows you is how the ideas of Buddhism and Hinduism spreading eastwards. And then in the 15th century, there's a further wave, which is the arrival, particularly in Malacca, of Islam, and transformations taking place following on from that during the 15th century.
We've heard a lot, particularly in best-selling accounts like Peter Frankopan's marvelous Silk Roads, about the importance of overland trade and this wonderful image of these camel caravans crossing the Pamirs and Marco Polo and so on. But I think up until now, there's been much less emphasis on the maritime sea trade. Do you think that's fair, that we've underrated how much of human contact took place along the sea routes, particularly the Indian Ocean routes you're talking about?
Very much. That's one of the obsessions, I suppose, of my book, The Boundless Sea, that the Silk Road across Eurasia was a very intermittent, it wasn't even a road, it was a set of routes which occasionally interconnected. And they interconnected when political conditions were right. So in the late Roman Empire, there was a period when it was possible to make that journey all the way to China overland. And that had very important repercussions for the spread of Buddhism in particular from Central Asia towards China. And then again, when the Mongols, when they took control of China in the 13th century, as the career of Marco Polo shows, it was possible to go all the way overland, in his case, all the way from Venice through the Middle East, through Persia, and then all the way to China. But interestingly, Marco Polo came back by sea. Yes, he came back by sea, and he gives us a description of these enormous Chinese ships and so on. And that maritime route has a continuous history. What I always point to is the fact that the overland Silk Route is subject of romance and so on, but it had this very intermittent history. And on how many, I mean, some of these camel trains were miles and miles long, but even so, compared to the capacity of the ships, and we know about the capacity of the ships because of the shipwrecks. We have these.
You write beautifully about the Intan and the Belitung shipwrecks. One of the highlights of the book for me.
Yeah, well, I was about to mention Belitung and Intan. Indeed, yes, they are the most extraordinary discoveries in the southern edges of the South China Sea. We don't quite know whether the Belitung ship was where it was going, but these ships carried phenomenal quantities of porcelain in particular. And that's what survives under the water. Silk probably as well, but of course that would have disintegrated. And when I say phenomenal quantities, I'm talking about 500,000 pieces, something like that. And that continued, of course, across the centuries. So when you get into the 17th, 18th centuries, you have the Dutch and the Danes and so on importing, 1 million pieces of porcelain all the way from China to Europe on similar, well, on different sort of ship, but it's similar sort of phenomenon. So it's that.
And then the tea trade, finally. You write wonderfully about the tea trade at a later period.
Yeah, indeed. The great export, of course, became tea in the 17th, 18th centuries. First of all, from China, and only much later did it really take off in India. And that was facilitated ultimately by the building of railways, which made it possible to bring the tea down from northeast India to Kolkata. But the European passion for tea is a very important part of human history, because it's not just actually about tea, it's also about sugar. It's also about the need for sweeteners. And one of the things that I found...
For which millions were enslaved, and the entire Atlantic slave trade started. And...
Yes, absolutely. And when you actually look at the way in which this passion for tea spread, and the way in which, shall we call them capitalists, were able to gain control. I mean, Gothenburg in Sweden, you have these Scottish entrepreneurs who set themselves up in Gothenburg and become masters of a very large proportion of the tea traffic. So it comes into Sweden, then out to England and elsewhere, and across to America. And of course, in America, it played a very important role because the Boston Tea Party, the whole argument before the American Revolution against Great Britain broke out, the argument about taxation of tea. One of the things I point out is that actually the British plans for tea taxation in America at that point would have lowered the price of tea, but there were various monopolists who didn't want that to happen. It would have threatened their business, so they threw it in the water. Yeah.
So looking forward, do you see further ocean books for you, David? Have you exhausted the oceans, or are there more sea routes to be sailed?
There are other seas I'm interested in. I suppose I've exhausted the oceans for the moment, anyway. But I'd like to write about some of those seas that I've never really said much about, like the Black Sea, which is a sort of extension of the Mediterranean, but really has a fascinating life of its own. You think of cities like Odessa, founded in fairly recent times, but also the Vikings coming down to the Black Sea, down the river routes, all the way to Constantinople. There's a lot about Georgia and all those countries. There's a lot to be said there about the Caspian, about which very little is known. So I want to delve into some of those seas and think about different ways, really, of writing the history of the sea. I've got my own particular way, which turns on human intervention, the importance of trade and cultural contact, but I might experiment with some different ways of doing it as well.
And what's this next book going to be called? Have you got a title? How are you going to bind it together?
The title means that I don't really have to bind it together. The Seven Seas. What are the seven seas? I mean, I'm going to vary the very different types of sea, 7 totally different types of sea. I may go back to 1 or 2 that I've written about before, like the Caribbean, about which there's always a great deal to be said, particularly in the time before Columbus. But I'd like to make it sort of global in the sense that I look at seas right across the world.
We're just running out of time, but just which 7 are they? What
Well, I have actually signed the contract, but I haven't actually finalized the list. So let me give you examples. The Caspian Sea is, some people don't regard it as a sea because it's not very salty, but anyway, it is the largest inland sea, or the largest lake in the world, and it's fed by the Volga. So you have all these Vikings again coming down and reaching all the way down into Persia, from Kiev and so on, reaching Persia, from which they brought back vast quantities of silver. You have I don't know if you've ever heard of this happening, but the Genoese in the age of Tamerlane launching ships on the Caspian Sea.
Goodness.
I mean, there was always this sort of fascination with the idea that Europeans could team up with the Persians against the Ottomans. They understood that Persian Islam was a bit different, and maybe the Persians would be a bit more sympathetic to the Christian cause. So they're really fascinating things. And in modern times, of course, Baku, great center of the oil industry, but it has a very long history. So that's one. And the Black Sea, as I've said. But I'd also like to go back to the Adriatic, which is like a sort of Mediterranean within the Mediterranean, and those relationships between the sandy shores on the Italian side and the rocky shores on the Dalmatian side, which resulted in a very active slave trade, in silver trade, but also one of the most fascinating features is the spread of a rampant heresy in Bosnia, what became known in Europe as the Albigensian or Cathar heresy, and spreading from there into Italy.
Runciman
these religious,
medieval humanity.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, there are these medieval religious connections, unexpected ones in many ways. And even before that, it's the dividing line between Catholic Europe and Greek Orthodox or Slavonic Orthodox Europe. So there are fascinating things to say about that. And yeah, and the list, I just keep changing my mind about some of the others.
But are you, final question before we close this out, in this age of COVID, when we're all stuck at home, how are you going to be researching any of this?
Well, that is one of the worries. And that actually, in a sense, is easier writing a book which consists of basically 7 essays and a short book. My great ambition is to write a short book. The Boundless Sea is a very long book, and I would love to write a book of just 200 or 300 pages. And so a series of essays. I do have quite a large collection of books myself, but it is very frustrating at the moment for everybody getting access to the great libraries, the University Library in Cambridge, the Bodleian Library in Oxford. You have to sort of book a place, and you have really to plan in advance exactly what you're going to ask for and so on. It's not how one really wants to use it. Much, you can't sort of walk along the shelves and just pick off the things that you really want.
Look interesting.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. A great, great pleasure. Very kind of you to break from your researches for this, and we look forward to the next as much. And anyone listening to this that hasn't read The Boundless Sea, my book of the year, you'll find it in the Spectator next week, David.
Oh, that's very kind. Oh, thank you very much. That is really very kind.
Thank you.
And thank you. It's been a great pleasure, and yeah, someday maybe we come together in Jaipur, I hope. Yeah.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you, David. Thank you, William, for that insightful and fascinating conversation. Truly, David, we look forward to reading your new book whenever it comes out. Thank you once again, and thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We'd like to thank all our official partners for their support towards the festival. I hope you all enjoyed these conversations, and will log back on for our next session, Running Towards Mystery, the adventure of an unconventional life. The Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi in conversation with Mayank Shekhar at 8 p.m. MST, which is 8:30 a.m. IST. Thank you once again, and now we present a reading from the JLF Writers Short Series.
Today I'm reading from my poem, I Used to Live Here, But I. I used to live here, but I don't live here anymore. We used to sit on your ugly green couch cuddling, nested together, eating too much. But today you watch TV with someone new. You live among take-up boxes and the clothes I left when I left you. Your kitchen is a hopeless void. She tries to cook for you, but everything is cardboard and gluten-free. Here, you pretend it tastes great. My bruised ego, your rotten conscience. I pause. Starved for refrigerated leftovers, I look for something to eat, but all my food is in your kitchen, and I'm not hungry anymore. I crave the white lights your roommate loves, nights on that couch, and the times you made avocado toast. I took the panda mug, but my Tupperware gathers dust in your cabinets. Open them to smell chicken curry, bacon pasta, reminders of food we used to eat, but we don't eat together anymore. Thank you.
I would call the Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the sense of literature and of life.
about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
I think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia, and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature, and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars. Be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Iron India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India Circuit is an endeavor by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross, and Dave Weckl, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks, meditation, talks and workshops are part of this weekend experience. Teamwork also promotes and recognizes the best of Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. The Meta Week in Delhi is an enthralling showcase of the 10 best nominated plays shortlisted from numerous entries received from across the country and across languages. The Meta Lifetime Achievement Award has been presented to leading lights of India's theatre industry. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Bollywood Love Story, a musical. Our international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Flamenco India have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt, Russia and Spain. Expressions International Contemporary Dance Festival showcases Indian and international productions, bringing together several dance genres for Indian audiences. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com.
I think everywhere I've ever lived, I always looked for the library. They come to the library because they want to be with people.
Corporations are not people in the library. People are people, right? And so being able to come in and participate and learn and control that learning experience is what we offer to the community. And that's a beautiful thing. It can develop into something amazing.
We want them to recognize that they have the agency and the potential to create change and have a voice.
To become what they hope to be, to empower them to realize their aspirations.
No matter who they are, no matter what age they are, no matter what their background or ability is.
We're going to learn together, right?
And you know what? Not just me, because I want to create together, but I think we want to create together.
Give us your knowledge, give us what you do best. Give us your culture, give us good feedback, give us bad feedback, give us any feedback. Let us grow with you. Just come and ask too.
Ask a librarian. We're all here waiting to help you.
To work together, to collaborate, and to come up with a larger, louder voice as a collective.
We are bolder together.
We are wait.
Somos bolder juntos.
We are bolder.
Bolder?
Bolder together.
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 We're bolder together, we're bolder together.
I would call the Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the sense of literature and of life.
So much about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
I think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia, and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature, and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars. Be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Iron India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India Circuit is an endeavor by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross, and Dave Weckel, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks